Welcome, my friend, to History in Ashes. Here, we walk through the past not as if it were distant and untouchable, but as if its smoke still lingers in the air you breathe. Tonight, you are not just watching a video. You are entering a world that ended and began again on a May morning in 1453, when the walls of Constantinople trembled under cannon fire and the Ottoman banner would rise where the Byzantine cross had stood for 1,000 years. But before we lose ourselves in this long and winding tale, I want to pause. Could you do me a small favor? Go to the comments right now and tell me where you are watching this from and what time it is there. Are you listening in the middle of the night with the lights off, or is this your afternoon lull? And while you're down there, think about subscribing to the channel, because, let's be honest, the Ottomans would never let you pass through their empire without paying a tax. And here, the only tax I ask is a friendly little subscribe button. Consider it your toll for safe passage into history. Now, back to the walls. You stand before the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. They are old, layered fortifications built in the 5th century, repaired and strengthened across ages, and thought by many to be impenetrable. Behind them, life in the city still moves. Bakers knead dough for the morning bread. Priests pray in the shadowed corners of Hagia Sophia. Children cling to their mothers, asking why the ground keeps trembling. Outside, however, the Ottomans are not trembling. They are patient. They are organized. And at their center is Sultan Mehmed, a young man not yet 21, determined to do what generations before him had only dreamed. Take the city that had stood as the crown of empires for a millennium. It is easy to imagine cannons and chaos, but history often hides in the quieter details. Consider the cannon itself, cast by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, so massive it required hundreds of oxen to drag it to the walls. Its iron balls weighed more than half a ton each. Every shot shook the ground like thunder rolling over the sea. Yet for all the firepower, it was not simply the weaponry that brought down Constantinople. It was persistence, supply lines, the quiet labor of engineers digging trenches, carpenters building siege towers, men ferrying food across the strait. The empire was built not only by the clash of swords, but by bakers, smiths, and farmers whose names we will never know. As you listen, picture the sounds, the clash of hammers on iron, the creak of wooden wheels rolling over mud, the endless chanting of prayers within the walls. Imagine the smell of burning pitch as defenders poured it onto ladders, the acrid smoke rising into the spring air. These details, the so-called boring ones, are what really shaped history. Without them, no empire could rise, and no empire could fall. When the Ottomans pressed closer, the Byzantines scrambled for allies. But the truth was that their empire had shrunk to a shadow. Once, the Byzantine world had stretched from Italy to Anatolia, yet by the 15th century it was little more than the city itself, a few strongholds, and a long memory of greatness. Their emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos ruled with dignity, but dignity does not feed soldiers. The Venetians and Genoese sent some support, yet it was not enough. Inside, food supplies dwindled. People debated not just politics but survival. How much flour remained? How long could the cisterns hold out? How many days before hope turned to despair? Meanwhile, the Ottoman army was not merely a mob at the gates. It was a machine of administration. Quartermasters ensured that every soldier received bread and rations. Scouts rode across Thrace to secure the countryside. The Janissaries, elite infantry raised from Christian boys taken through the Dev-Shirmi system, stood ready at the heart of the army. These men had been trained from youth, their loyalty bound to the Sultan himself. Their discipline contrasted with the desperate improvisation inside the walls. Think about this for a moment. Empires rise not because of dramatic battles alone, but because of systems that can sustain them. A tax collected from a peasant in Anatolia bought the flour that fed a soldier at Constantinople. A shipwright in the Black Sea hammered together timbers that would one day block the Golden Horn. Every dull, everyday act was a stone in the vast structure of empire. And then came the morning of May 29th. The assault began before dawn. Waves of soldiers surged forward, some armed with nothing more than ladders and faith. The defenders fought back, arrow by arrow, stone by stone, desperate to hold. For hours, the outcome was uncertain. Then, through a breach in the walls, the Janissaries pressed. In the chaos, Constantine XI was last seen casting aside his imperial regalia and throwing himself into the fray. Whether he died on the wall or in the streets, no one knows for certain. What we do know is that by midday, the city that had once been Rome's eastern jewel was Ottoman. Pause here with me. Imagine the silence that followed. Imagine walking the streets when the shouting subsided. Hagia Sophia, once the grand church of Christendom, now echoed with the prayers of Islam. Families searched for one another among the ruins. Some hid, some fled, some accepted the new order. Empires change not just with banners and declarations, but with the question of who will bake bread tomorrow, who will open the market, who will keep the water flowing through the aqueducts. Mehmed did not simply want a conquest, he wanted a capital. He declared Constantinople the new seat of his empire, renaming it Istanbul, though the older name would echo on in different forms. He ordered that the city be repopulated, drawing in Muslims, Christians and Jews alike. Streets that had been silent filled again with merchants and artisans. New mosques rose, but so too did markets, caravanserais, and fountains. The Ottoman dream was not just about taking a city, it was about making it live again under their order. You see, the fall of Constantinople was not merely an end, it was a beginning. It marked the close of Byzantium, but also the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a true world power. From this moment, the Ottomans could project influence into Europe, dominate trade across the Mediterranean, and stand as rivals to kings and popes alike. Yet, just as importantly, it was a victory of administration, of quiet persistence, of logistics as much as cannons. Think of the families who now settled within the city. Armenians who baked bread in new ovens, Greeks who continued their crafts under Ottoman rule, Jewish merchants who brought trade connections. Daily life did not stop. It shifted. The dull details of survival became the threads of a new empire. Children born in the years after 1453 would grow up never knowing Byzantium. For them, Istanbul was Ottoman, and it would remain so for centuries. But history is never simple. With the fall of Constantinople, Europe looked east with alarm. Some saw it as the end of the old world, the closing of trade routes, the threat of Ottoman expansion pressing ever closer. Others, ironically, would turn west, seeking sea routes around Africa, and eventually across the Atlantic. In this way, the fall of a city helped set in motion the age of exploration, reshaping the globe itself. So let me leave you with a thought. When we picture empire, we imagine banners, swords, and sieges. Yet often, it is the quiet movements, the baker kneading dough, the mason setting stones, the tax collector writing figures in a ledger that determine the fate of civilizations. If Constantinople had held, how different might the world be? Would Europe have sought new horizons so urgently? Would Istanbul have become the heart of an empire that lasted centuries? Or would history have turned another way entirely? When the dust of conquest settled and the last echo of cannon fire faded, Sultan Mehmed did not waste time celebrating. To him, Constantinople was not a trophy, but a foundation. Imagine walking through the city in the weeks after its fall. Burned houses, shattered walls, frightened families huddled in corners of once grand streets. To rule here meant more than holding it by force. It meant giving it life again, because an empire that only conquers and does not sustain soon collapses under its own weight. Mehmed began with something simple yet crucial: people. A city of stones without citizens is no capital. He ordered that Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across his domains be resettled in the city. Families were granted property, traders encouraged to open shops, artisans given space to work. The empire needed bakers to feed soldiers, blacksmiths to repair weapons, builders to mend walls, scribes to record taxes. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, was deliberately transformed into a mosaic of communities, each with a place in the larger order. This was not generosity, it was policy. An empty city could not collect taxes, and that is the dull but significant truth of empire. Taxes, registers, and routine. In the early Ottoman system, a landholder did not always own his land outright. Instead, the empire often used a taimar system, granting land revenues to cavalrymen in exchange for military service. This meant that in peacetime, a soldier became a local manager, ensuring crops were harvested, rents collected, and peasants protected. In wartime, that same man rode out with arms funded by the revenues of that land. It was efficient, tying together the fields and the battlefield in one loop of survival. Meanwhile, at the center of this system was the sultan's household, which was far more than a family. The palace was both a residence and a bureaucracy. From the kitchens that cooked meals for thousands, to the scribes who carefully maintained imperial decrees, the palace symbolized the idea that empire could be orderly. It was within these walls that Mehmed set about codifying laws, establishing not only military power but also judicial authority. Sharia law intertwined with the sultan's own decrees, creating a layered system that reached from the capital down to the smallest village. But let us not forget the human faces behind these systems. Imagine a peasant in Anatolia during the later 15th century. His life may have looked simple, even monotonous, tending fields, paying taxes in grain, hoping for a good harvest. Yet his wheat might be carried by caravan to Istanbul, baked into bread that fed the janissaries, or sold in the bustling markets of the new capital. Without his labor, the empire could not stand. Or think of a young boy taken through the Devshirme system, the levy on Christian populations, where sons were recruited, converted, and trained to serve as janissaries or bureaucrats. For his family, it may have been heartbreak. For him, it was a path into the heart of empire, a chance to rise not by birth but by service. Both lives, though very different, fed into the machinery of Ottoman rule. As Istanbul revived, Mehmed also looked outward. With Constantinople secure, he extended Ottoman control into the Balkans, consolidating lands already conquered and pressing further into Europe. The key was not only military strength but also administration. Newly conquered territories were integrated into the taimar system, local elites either incorporated or replaced, and the slow work of taxation and governance began. This was the unglamorous side of conquest. Ledgers filled with figures, disputes over land boundaries, long rides by tax collectors through muddy roads. Yet these were the details that held the empire together. Trade too became a lifeline. Istanbul sat at the meeting point of worlds between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between Asia and Europe. Caravans brought silk and spices from the east. Ships carried grain, fish, and wool from the Black Sea coast. Markets swelled with goods, and with goods came taxes, and with taxes came soldiers. Every merchant haggling over prices was, in his own way, part of the empire's survival strategy. Life within the city began to take on rhythm. The call to prayer echoed 5 times a day, marking the passage of hours. Artisans clustered in guilds, regulating who could make shoes, who could weave cloth, who could sell bread. Water flowed through repaired aqueducts, feeding fountains where people gathered. Hagia Sophia, now converted into a mosque, symbolized both continuity and change. The old stone walls remained, but their meaning had shifted under Ottoman hands, and still, at the heart of it all, was the Sultan himself. Mehmed earned the title, the Conqueror, but he was also a planner, a builder, and a lawgiver. His successors would inherit a system that could endure not only because of battlefield victories, but because of the invisible daily labor of countless ordinary people. Think for a moment about what it meant to live under Ottoman rule in this period. If you were a Christian villager in the Balkans, you might still attend church, for the empire allowed communities to manage their own religious affairs under the millet system. Priests collected taxes, administered marriages, and kept traditions alive, so long as the larger dues to the empire were paid. For Muslims, life was intertwined with the structures of mosque, guild, and court, all tied back to the Sultan. For Jews expelled from Spain in the late 15th century, Istanbul offered refuge, a place where synagogues could rise again, even as Europe closed its doors. Empires often survive by making room for difference, not erasing it. The Ottomans mastered this balance, not equality, but coexistence under their rule. It was a practical arrangement. By letting communities manage their own internal affairs, the empire avoided endless disputes, while ensuring loyalty through taxes and obligations. As the 16th century dawned, the Ottomans were not simply another regional power. They were becoming a world empire, with Istanbul as their beating heart. But behind the palaces, the mosques, and the armies, the story remained one of persistence. A merchant balancing accounts, a farmer sowing grain, a clerk copying records late into the night by lamplight. These unremarkable tasks were the lifeblood of empire. So ask yourself this: when we talk about the glory of the Ottoman rise, do we picture too quickly the sultans and their armies, forgetting the men and women whose routine labors sustained it all? What mattered more, in the end, the cannon that broke the walls, or the steady stream of flour that baked bread for the soldiers who marched beyond them? By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had already proven itself a power to be reckoned with, yet its story was only just beginning to crest. It is easy to imagine an empire as a line of sultans and battles, but if you had walked through the streets of Istanbul in those years, you would have seen something else. The rhythm of a city alive with languages, trades, and faiths, all woven together into a patchwork that somehow held. And in the midst of it all stood a figure who would give the empire its golden age. Suleiman, whom history would call the Magnificent. Born in 1494, Suleiman inherited the throne in 1520, when his father, Selim the Grim, passed away. Selim had been fierce, expanding the empire deep into the Middle East and bringing the holy cities of Mecca and Medina under Ottoman control. This meant that when Suleiman stepped into power, he inherited not a fragile state, but a robust machine, one that could feed, clothe, and command hundreds of thousands. Yet even a strong machine needs guidance, and Suleiman would not be content to simply maintain. He would expand, reform, and build. Imagine him in his palace, young but steady, already with the weight of millions on his shoulders. He was not merely a warrior, but also a legislator, known in Ottoman lands as the lawgiver. And here lies one of the less glamorous but most significant truths of his reign. Empires endure not just by winning wars, but by writing rules that people can live by. Suleiman worked to harmonize the different legal traditions of his lands. Sharia law, rooted in Islamic teaching, remained central, but alongside it stood the Sultan's own decrees, Kanun, covering everything from property disputes to taxes. To a villager in the Balkans or a merchant in Aleppo, these laws mattered more than distant wars. They decided whether a debt could be enforced, whether a piece of land could be inherited, or how much tax was owed. These were the dull details that kept the empire functioning day to day. But of course, the empire did not stand still. Suleiman led campaigns that extended Ottoman rule deeper into Europe, famously pressing into Hungary and even laying siege to Vienna in 1529. Picture that moment. Ottoman troops at the very edge of Europe's heartland, their tents dotting the fields, while rain poured and mud sucked at soldiers' boots. The siege would ultimately fail, but it was not a disaster. It was a warning shot that echoed across the continent. To European rulers, the Ottomans were no longer a distant Eastern power. They were neighbors, formidable and unrelenting. At sea, too, the empire flourished. Under admirals like Barbarossa, Ottoman fleets ruled the Mediterranean, clashing with Spanish and Venetian forces, raiding coastlines and protecting vital trade routes. Imagine the creak of oars, the snap of sails in the wind, the smell of tar and salt as galleys cut across the water. Control of the sea meant control of commerce, and commerce meant wealth. Spices from India, silk from Persia, grain from Egypt, all passed through Ottoman hands, each transaction adding to the empire's coffers. Yet while victories and wealth made headlines, it was what happened quietly within the empire that gave Suleiman his enduring reputation. Architecture flourished, with the great architect Sinan designing mosques, bridges, and aqueducts that still stand today. These were not just monuments to faith, but public works that served the people. Aqueducts carried water into growing cities. Caravanserais gave merchants safe places to rest along their journeys. Mosques doubled as community centers, schools, and kitchens for the poor. For the common man or woman, these mattered far more than whether Vienna had fallen or not. In the heart of Istanbul, life pulsed through the markets. Picture yourself walking through the Grand Bazaar, which was already thriving in Suleiman's time. The smell of spices hung in the air: cinnamon, saffron, pepper. Traders shouted prices, haggling over cloth, jewels, and ceramics. Languages blended Turkish, Greek, Armenian, Arabic, Italian. A Christian farmer from the Balkans might be selling cheese next to a Muslim potter from Anatolia, or a Jewish merchant trading silver brought from afar. Each coin that clinked into a merchant's hand was another drop in the river of commerce that fed the empire. But life was not always fair or easy. The Timar system still shaped rural existence, binding peasants to land and requiring them to pay dues in crops or labor. Taxes were collected with rigor, and corruption sometimes flourished despite Suleiman's efforts at reform. If you were a villager in the mountains of Albania, the empire might feel distant most days, but when the tax collector rode into town with his ledgers, the reality of Ottoman rule pressed heavily on your shoulders. Survival meant keeping up with obligations, whether or not the harvest had been kind. Inside the empire's elite circles, the devshirme system continued, drawing Christian boys into the janissary corps, or palace service. Some families resisted bitterly, hiding their sons, but others came to see it as a strange kind of opportunity. For the boy himself, it meant leaving behind family and faith, yet it also offered a path to power that no peasant birth could otherwise provide. Many rose to become grand viziers, commanding armies, or overseeing vast provinces. Their lives, torn from ordinary roots, became threads in the fabric of Ottoman strength. Suleiman's reign was also shaped by personal relationships, most famously with his wife, Hurrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana. She was not born into power but came as a slave, rising to become not only his consort but a political figure in her own right. Through her, we see how even in the rigid structures of empire, unexpected figures could wield influence. Her story reminds us that history is never just about kings and generals. It is also about those who found ways to bend the structures around them. And while the empire expanded and flourished, the wider world shifted. Across the Atlantic, Spanish and Portuguese ships were opening new trade routes, carrying silver and spices that would slowly change global economics. The Ottomans did not yet feel the full force of this shift, but it was coming. For now, their empire stretched across 3 continents, from the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Hungary, from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And yet, even at this height, the empire was built not only on sultans and soldiers, but on the endless routine of ordinary life. Merchants weighing goods, clerks copying records, mothers baking bread. So, as you picture Suleiman's court in its splendor, the silken robes, the jeweled turbans, the golden halls also picture the unseen foundations. A shepherd in Anatolia counting his flock, a fisherman in the Aegean mending his nets, a teacher in a small madrasa guiding children through their lessons. These lives were not glamorous, But without them, Suleiman's empire would have been an empty shell. Let me leave you with this. When we call him the Magnificent, are we speaking only of his victories and palaces, or also of the quiet order he gave to daily life? Was it the roar of cannons at Vienna, or the steady flow of water through Sinan's aqueducts that truly defined the Ottoman Golden Age? By the middle of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire stretched across lands so wide that a messenger might ride for months and still remain under the shadow of the Sultan. From the plains of Hungary to the deserts of Arabia, from the mountains of Anatolia to the fertile Nile Valley, all of it was bound loosely, unevenly, but bound under one authority. Yet an empire that sprawls cannot rely on the charisma of one man alone. It requires systems, paperwork, and countless small decisions carried out by countless ordinary hands. Imagine the imperial chancery in Istanbul, rooms filled with scribes bent over parchment, copying decrees in precise calligraphy. Each document mattered, whether it was a tax exemption for a village, an order for supplies to be sent to an army, or the appointment of a new judge in a distant town. These papers travelled along roads, carried by couriers who stopped at caravanserais for food and rest, before delivering them across provinces. The empire lived through ink as much as through sword. At the top of the bureaucracy stood the Grand Vizier, the Sultan's chief minister. Beneath him, a hierarchy of viziers, judges, treasurers, and governors stretched out across the empire. Yet many of these men were not born into wealth or power. They often came from the devshirme system, raised from childhood in service to the state, their loyalty not to family dynasties but to the Ottoman household itself. This was one of the empire's peculiar strengths. It drew outsiders in, converted them, trained them, and bound them to the Sultan. A Christian boy from Bosnia could become the Grand Vizier, commanding armies and managing finances. Social mobility of this kind was rare in the medieval world, and it helped create a sense of professionalism in Ottoman administration. Still, bureaucracy alone could not govern provinces thousands of miles away. The empire relied on local notables, landlords, religious leaders, and community heads to manage affairs on the ground. This was the millet system in practice. Christians, Jews, and Muslims were allowed to maintain their own courts and customs, so long as they acknowledged the ultimate authority of the Sultan and paid their taxes. For an Armenian merchant in Anatolia or a Greek priest in the Balkans, this arrangement was practical. It meant they could continue their traditions without constant interference, while the empire avoided exhausting itself in endless micromanagement. Taxes were the lifeblood of this system. Without them, armies could not march, aqueducts could not be repaired, and palaces could not shine. Tax collectors were the empire's quiet soldiers, feared and resented more than the janissaries. Imagine one riding into a village. He dismounts, opens his ledger, and calls out the names of households. Grain is weighed, coins counted, disputes argued. Sometimes the harvest had been poor, and villagers begged for leniency. Sometimes bribes changed hands in the shadows. For the peasant, this moment decided whether the winter would mean hunger or survival. For the empire, it meant the difference between stability and revolt. And revolts did happen. In Anatolia, for example, the 16th century saw uprisings known as the Salali rebellions, often sparked by heavy taxation, corruption, or famine. To the central government, these were nuisances to be crushed. But to the villagers who rose up, they were desperate bids for dignity and survival. Here we see the paradox of empire. It provided order, protection, and prosperity at times, but it also pressed heavily on those who lived at its margins. Meanwhile, the provinces themselves were not uniform. Egypt, for instance, remained a wealthy and distinct land, governed by Ottoman appointees but shaped by its own traditions. Its grain fed not only Cairo but Istanbul itself. The Nile's cycles mattered to the empire's stability. A bad flood could ripple all the way to the capital, raising bread prices and stirring unrest. In the Balkans, on the other hand, The empire relied on mountain villages and strategic fortresses, less about grain and more about soldiers and trade routes. In Arabia, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina carried religious weight, binding the Ottomans not only to politics but to the spiritual life of millions of Muslims. The diversity of the empire was both a strength and a challenge. Markets in Aleppo bustled with silk caravans from Persia, while in Bosnia, shepherds led flocks across green pastures. In Baghdad, scholars debated theology, while in the Aegean, fishermen cast their nets into the sea. All of these lives were part of one imperial map, but each followed its own rhythms. Holding them together required flexibility, governors who could adapt, judges who could mediate, soldiers who could enforce. Think for a moment about communication. Without telegraphs or trains, news moved at the pace of a horse or a ship. A rebellion in the mountains might rage for weeks before Istanbul even knew of it. By the time an order arrived, the situation might have already changed. This meant that local officials often acted on their own judgment, balancing loyalty to the Sultan with the realities of their province. The empire was centralized in theory, but in practice, it was a web of local negotiations. Trade was another binding thread. The Ottoman Empire controlled routes that linked Europe with Asia. Caravans carried spices, textiles, and metals across Anatolia, while ships ferried goods across the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Every transaction was taxed, every port regulated. Yet the traders themselves were often outsiders. Armenians, Greeks, Jews, Italians, the Ottomans understood that commerce thrived on diversity, and so they tolerated, sometimes begrudgingly, sometimes eagerly, the presence of many different peoples. For the empire, it was simple math. More traders meant more taxes. But wealth also brought complexity. Istanbul became a magnet for people seeking opportunity. Its population swelled, and with it came slums, crime, and disease. The city needed food, water, and order. Here, the architecture of Sinan and others was not just art, but infrastructure. Aqueducts carried water, markets regulated prices, public kitchens fed the poor. These were practical solutions, but they also carried symbolic weight. They showed that the empire cared for its subjects, at least enough to keep them loyal. Consider daily life for an ordinary inhabitant of the empire in this era. If you were a Muslim artisan in Istanbul, your day began with the call to prayer before sunrise. You might spend hours in a workshop, shaping leather into shoes or hammering iron into tools. Your guild set standards for your trade, ensured fair prices, and sometimes even mediated disputes. At midday, you paused for prayer, then returned to work, hoping for enough customers to feed your family. If you were a Christian farmer in Serbia, your rhythm was tied to the land, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, paying taxes in grain or livestock, praying in your village church. Life was hard, but it was structured, predictable, so long as no war, plague, or tax hike disturbed it. All of this order, however, rested on a delicate balance. The Sultan was supreme, but his reach was limited by distance, corruption, and local power. The Janissaries, once fiercely loyal, were beginning to grow restless, their privileges expanding. Governors grew ambitious, sometimes defying orders. Villagers, weary of taxes, sometimes resisted. Beneath the golden surface of Suleiman's reign lay cracks not fatal yet, but present. So let me ask you this. When we speak of empire, do we picture its grand palaces and victories? Or do we also imagine the tax collector's ledger, the weary farmer's harvest, the judge's court in a dusty provincial town? Which mattered more to the survival of the empire, the Sultan's brilliance, or the countless invisible acts of administration that kept bread in the markets and coins in the treasury? The cannon roars fade, the walls are broken, and the great city has changed forever. Yet, while you and I might stand stunned at the sight of 1,000 years of empire collapsing in a single dawn, the story of the Ottomans had only just begun. For though the conquest of Constantinople felt like an ending to the Romans of the East, for the Ottomans it was a beginning, the solid ground on which a sprawling empire would rise. And so, if we step back from the smoke and rubble, what do we see? We see a people not entirely new to the stage of history, but still raw, still flexible, still restless. Before they stood at those walls, they had been wanderers. They had carried little with them beyond faith, horses, and the resilience of tribes moving westward from the harsh lands of Central Asia. Out of those migrations, they grew into frontier warriors, Ghazis, fighting for survival as much as for spoils. It was not glorious in the way the chronicles sometimes pretend life was hard, food often scarce, and the terrain unforgiving. But in those years of struggle, the habits of the Ottomans were formed, practical, disciplined, suspicious of excess, and skilled at seizing opportunity wherever it appeared. If you could walk among them in those early days, before they became rulers of Constantinople, you would not see a people of splendor. You would see leather rather than silk, rough bread rather than feasts, camps that could be raised and struck quickly. The discipline of survival was their greatest inheritance. Every small choice mattered: when to strike, when to wait, whom to ally with, whom to betray. These details, dull at first glance, shaped the bones of empire long before there was an empire to speak of. In the decades before 1453, the Ottomans had spread carefully through Anatolia and into the Balkans. They were masters not of overwhelming strength, but of patient, layered control. A fortress here, a marriage alliance there, a tax arrangement that kept local lords quiet, a grant of land to a loyal cavalryman. Nothing dramatic, nothing glamorous, but each step brought them closer to the walls of Constantinople. The Byzantines had once stretched across the known world, yet by the 15th century their land was a shrinking circle, and the Ottomans knew how to tighten a circle. It is worth pausing on something that might seem trivial. The Ottomans often left their conquered subjects alone, so long as tribute was paid and order was maintained. This was not mercy in the modern sense, but pragmatism. They lacked the resources to govern every inch of territory directly, so they allowed systems to remain. The Greeks in the countryside continued to farm their wheat. The Armenians continued their trade. The Slavs kept their villages. Taxes flowed upward. Soldiers were levied when needed, and in return people were largely left with their customs and their faiths. It was not freedom, but it was stability. And for many peasants, stability was a rare luxury in those centuries of shifting war. Now, the Ottomans had Constantinople. The city was renamed Istanbul, but in truth it was not so much renamed as repurposed. The wide avenues of Roman emperors were overgrown with weeds. Aqueducts that once carried water across miles were broken. Much of the population had fled or been killed. To most outsiders, the city looked like a corpse, a relic. But to Mehmet, the 21-year-old conqueror, this was a canvas. He ordered people to return, forced resettlement when volunteers were not enough. He restored the water system, reopened markets, and converted the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, both symbolic and practical. The capital of an empire must look like a capital, even if it begins in ruins. And here lies a strange thought for you to hold on to. The Ottomans did not rise by invention alone, but by recycling. They took what was broken and patched it, what was abandoned and reused it, what was old and claimed it as new. The Byzantine administrative system was not wiped away overnight. It was adjusted, blended into Ottoman needs. The Christian churches did not all vanish. Some became mosques, but others remained. The Greek scribes, the Jewish merchants, the Armenian craftsmen, all were drawn into this new empire. Diversity was not a choice of tolerance, but a necessity of empire building. If you had walked through the city in the years after its fall, you would have smelled both ash and spice, seen ruins beside construction, heard Turkish mingling with Greek and Arabic in the marketplaces. It was noisy, uneasy, but alive again. An empire had planted its roots not in a field of triumph, but in a landscape of contradictions. And that is where I will leave you for now, with the image of a young sultan walking through broken streets, imagining domes and palaces that do not yet exist, convinced that from this ruin something lasting can be built. But I wonder, do you think an empire is strongest when it begins with vision, or when it begins with necessity? You might imagine that after Suleiman's glittering rain palaces glistening, armies undefeated, laws codified, the empire would simply keep climbing higher, reaching ever greater heights. But history is rarely that generous. The truth is, the Ottoman Empire after Suleiman entered a long, uneasy twilight, a period not of collapse all at once, but of slow unraveling, like a great tapestry fraying at the edges, while the pattern at the center still looks strong. Let us start with succession, the question of who would rule when the great sultan was gone. Under Suleiman, the system was brutal but efficient. His sons fought, and only one survived to claim the throne. But later, the Ottomans grew wary of princes tearing the empire apart in civil war. So they developed a practice that was meant to reduce bloodshed, but ended up draining vitality from the throne. Instead of competing, potential heirs were locked away in the kafes, the cage, a section of the Topkapi Palace, where princes lived in isolation until called upon to rule. Imagine being raised in gilded imprisonment, with no experience of governance, no sense of the empire's vastness, no practice in diplomacy or command, and then suddenly, one day, being handed the throne. Some rulers managed, but many emerged timid, indecisive, or unstable. The cage produced sultans who were more ornamental than capable, men who bore the title but not the fire. As the throne weakened, other groups filled the void. The palace women, especially the sultan's mother, the Valid Sultan, began to exert real influence. Some were shrewd and effective, guiding the empire through turbulent times. Others indulged in intrigue, factionalism, or corruption. This era became known as the Sultanate of Women, and while that label is often unfairly dismissive, it does highlight how power shifted away from the battlefield into the harem. Decisions that once came from hardened warriors now sometimes trickled out of whispered conversations behind latticed screens. The Janissaries, too, changed. Once disciplined, celibate, loyal, they gradually grew complacent and corrupt. They married, took up trades, even passed down their positions to sons, turning what was supposed to be an elite fighting corps into something more like a hereditary guild. Worse, they discovered their political power. A sultan who displeased them might find himself deposed, or even strangled with a bowstring. They were kingmakers now, less soldiers than a force of political intimidation. For the empire's enemies, this was good news. The once feared Janissaries were no longer the razor-sharp blade of conquest, but a rusty, self-serving relic. Economics, too, played its part in the decline. The Ottomans had thrived on controlling trade routes between Europe and Asia, but then Portuguese and Spanish ships began sailing around Africa, bypassing Ottoman-controlled lands altogether. The silver pouring in from the Americas destabilized Ottoman currency, flooding markets and devaluing traditional revenues. Villages struggled, inflation soared, and the once mighty treasury found itself perpetually stretched. Imagine being a peasant farmer. Your taxes rise, your coins buy less, your local officials grow more corrupt. It feels as though the empire that once offered protection now only extracts suffering. And yet, decline is never a straight path downward. The Ottomans still won battles, still built mosques, still commanded respect. Their bureaucracy remained intricate, their culture vibrant. Istanbul's skyline still glittered with domes and minarets. Caravans still crossed Anatolia, and foreign ambassadors still treated the Sultan with awe. But the energy had shifted. Where once the empire had surged forward like a river in flood, it now meandered, slowed, and occasionally stagnated. One striking moment that revealed the empire's fading edge was the failed siege of Vienna in 1683. The Ottomans had besieged the city once before, in Suleiman's day, and though they failed then, they still radiated menace and power. But the second attempt ended in catastrophe. The Christian coalition, led by Poland's king John Sobieski, crushed the Ottoman forces. The defeat sent shockwaves. Europe was no longer trembling before the Crescent Banner. Instead, it was the Ottomans who would increasingly be on the defensive. After Vienna, treaties like Karlowitz, 1699, forced the empire to cede territory in Europe. This was the first time the Ottomans had to give up land through negotiation rather than simply conquer more elsewhere to balance the loss. It marked a turning point. The empire was no longer expanding, but shrinking. Yet decline is not only measured in borders. Let's peek inside Istanbul in the 17th century. Picture a crowded market, still bustling with merchants and spices, but where complaints of unfair taxes and corrupt officials are whispered between stalls. Picture a janissary not drilling with weapons but sipping coffee in a tavern, plotting how to manipulate the palace. Picture a sultan pacing in the cafes, nervous and untested, while his mother or advisors steer decisions. The empire still looked magnificent from afar, but if you leaned closer, you could see the cracks spidering across the surface. What's fascinating and almost tragic is how long the Ottomans endured despite these weaknesses. Lesser states would have crumbled quickly under such strains, but the Ottomans were vast, resilient, and layered. Their bureaucracy could absorb shocks, their religious system managed diversity, their sheer size gave them inertia. It's like watching a great oak tree. You can see rot setting in, branches breaking, leaves thinning, but the trunk is so massive it remains standing for generations longer than you'd expect. By the 18th century, Europe was entering the Enlightenment, scientific revolutions, industrial progress, centralized states, while the Ottomans lagged behind. Printing presses, for example, spread rapidly in Europe, fueling literacy and debate. But in the Ottoman world, religious authorities resisted printing for fear it would corrupt Islamic texts or undermine traditional scribes. So where pamphlets and newspapers transformed Europe, Ottoman knowledge circulated slowly. It was not that they lacked intelligence or creativity. They had brilliant architects, poets, and scholars, but the structures resisted innovation, and perhaps that is the real story of the Ottoman decline. Not a sudden collapse, but a steady failure to adapt. Where once they had been innovators in military recruitment, in administration, in blending cultures, they now became conservative, clinging to old systems even as the world around them raced forward. Still, do not imagine that life in the empire simply turned grim. Families still gathered for feasts, children still learned in schools, calligraphers still bent over parchment, crafting letters as delicate as lace. Life always goes on, even in decline. But the empire's destiny had shifted. No longer the unstoppable conqueror, the Ottomans were becoming the sick man of Europe, a state propped up by its past rather than propelled by its future. So as you lie here in the quiet, think of the empire as a vast city at twilight. The lamps are lit, the streets still hum with voices, but shadows lengthen, and somewhere in the distance you can hear the faint sound of doors closing. You might picture the empire under Suleiman and his immediate successors as unstoppable, with armies marching across Europe and the Middle East, banners flapping in the wind, cannon fire shaking cities. But life in the Ottoman Empire was rarely all spectacle. For most people, survival was the quiet, painstaking rhythm of labor, prayer, and trade. And yet, this rhythm created the foundation that allowed those grand campaigns to happen in the first place. By the late 16th century, Istanbul had become the heart of an empire larger than any one man could truly grasp. The city's population swelled with soldiers, merchants, scholars, and slaves, each contributing to the complex machinery of daily life. Streets were crowded, smells of markets heavy with spices, bread, and smoke. In the Grand Bazaar, merchants haggled over silks from Persia, ceramics from Anatolia, and jewels from India. Outside the city, Anatolian farmers tilled fields whose grains fed the capital, while artisans shaped leather, metal, and cloth for the growing urban population. Yet, beneath this vibrancy, subtle fractures were emerging. Suleiman's successors, though crowned sultans, were often inexperienced, sometimes confined for years in the cafes, a gilded cage designed to prevent fratricidal conflict, but which often produced rulers ill-prepared for governance. Some lacked decisiveness, others relied heavily on palace women, viziers, or janissaries to navigate the complexities of rule. The sultan remained absolute in theory, but in practice power began to diffuse, creating a delicate balance between the throne, the military, and the bureaucracy. The janissaries, once elite soldiers loyal only to the sultan, had begun to evolve into a politically powerful force. They were no longer isolated from society. Many married inherited positions and became entwined with the urban economy. Their loyalty remained critical, yet it became conditional. A sultan who angered them could be deposed or assassinated. For ordinary citizens, the janissaries represented both protection and potential danger. Their presence kept order, but their demands could disrupt daily life. Taxes, too, reflected the complexity of sustaining an empire across 3 continents. Land revenues, trade tariffs, and religious dues were meticulously recorded in ledgers and distributed through layers of administration. Villages in Anatolia, towns in the Balkans, and markets in Cairo all contributed to the treasury, but collection was uneven. Officials often abused their power, corruption crept into every level, and natural disasters, failed harvests, floods, or plagues, could destabilize the careful calculations that kept the state solvent. For the peasant, survival often meant negotiating, bribing, or bargaining simply to keep food on the table. Yet, despite these challenges, the Ottomans cultivated a rich cultural life that became a defining feature of their identity. Architecture flourished under the direction of Sinan, whose mosques, bridges, and aqueducts combined functionality with sublime beauty. Public works were both practical and symbolic. They provided water, shelter, and space for communal gathering, while simultaneously showcasing the empire's power and taste. Scholars and poets thrived as well, translating texts, debating theology, and chronicling the empire's accomplishments. Istanbul became a hub where learning and commerce coexisted, creating a tapestry of human experience that reached far beyond the Sultan's court. Daily life was organized around these rhythms. A farmer's day began at dawn, dictated by the call to prayer, and extended through labor in fields, tending livestock, or maintaining workshops. Artisans worked under guild systems that regulated standards, prices, and apprenticeships. Markets served as both economic and social centers, where information traveled as fast as goods. Even in moments of political tension, life continued. Bread was baked, clothes were mended, and children attended madrasas to learn reading, writing, and religious doctrine. Meanwhile, the empire's military still projected power beyond its borders. Campaigns in Hungary, the Mediterranean, and the Persian frontier demanded logistics that required careful planning. Food, ammunition, and horses had to be transported over long distances. Soldiers needed rotations and rest, and diplomatic relationships with local elites were maintained to ensure cooperation. A single miscalculation could derail a campaign, showing that military glory depended as much on administration as on courage. Religious life, too, was carefully structured. The Sultan was seen as the protector of Islam, but he also had to manage the diversity of his subjects. The millet system allowed Christians, Jews, and Muslims to coexist under their own leaders while paying tribute to the state. This system required constant negotiation. Judges, religious leaders, and provincial governors worked together to maintain stability. To the ordinary resident, this system was practical. It provided a measure of predictability and autonomy in daily life, even as political intrigues swirled above them. And yet, cracks were visible. Europe was beginning to modernize faster than the Ottoman Empire, and new trade routes bypassed Ottoman-controlled lands. Inflation, mismanagement, and corruption undermined long-term economic stability. Military campaigns, once decisive, began to encounter stiff resistance, revealing that the empire's previous methods of rapid expansion were no longer guaranteed to succeed. Slowly, the balance between central authority and provincial autonomy, between military power and civil administration, began to strain. But life continued, mundane and vital, under the shadow of these growing challenges. Istanbul's streets were alive with the sounds of negotiation and conversation, the smells of bread and coffee, the sights of workshops and mosques. Provinces far from the capital functioned on routines that connected them indirectly to the heart of the empire. Taxes sent up, military levies called down, local leaders mediating disputes. The machinery of daily life, the ordinary, often dull routines, was what allowed the Ottoman Empire to endure far longer than many of its contemporaries. So, as you imagine this world, palaces and workshops, soldiers and merchants, scholars and peasants, consider this. The Ottoman Golden Age was not simply a story of conquests and grand architecture. It was a story of systems, of networks, of ordinary people whose labor, faith, and ingenuity sustained an empire that spanned continents. The glories we remember were built on the unseen, the quiet, the routine. And here is the thought I leave with you. When an empire seems invincible, is it the sultan's power, the army's might, or the countless, invisible acts of daily life that truly hold it together? By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a sprawling, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious state, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the mountains of Anatolia to the Nile Delta. To the casual observer, it still appeared formidable. Vast armies, towering mosques, bustling markets, and a bureaucracy that seemed to hum with precision. Yet beneath the surface, the empire was showing signs of fatigue, subtle but unmistakable, like the slow erosion of a riverbank. One of the earliest cracks appeared in the military. The Janissaries, once the pinnacle of discipline and loyalty, had begun to diverge from their original purpose. They now married, inherited their positions, and increasingly demanded privileges beyond service. These elite soldiers were no longer a purely professional corps, but a powerful political force, capable of deposing sultans and influencing policy. At the same time, the empire's enemies were learning to adapt. European powers were innovating militarily and economically, introducing firearms, fortifications, and naval technology that outpaced Ottoman methods. Battles were no longer guaranteed victories. Losses became more common, and the empire's reputation for invincibility began to waver. The 18th century also brought economic challenges. European traders bypassed traditional Ottoman routes, sailing around Africa to bring spices, silk, and silver directly to their home ports. This shift undermined the empire's control over lucrative trade, reduced revenues, and contributed to inflation. Local officials, tasked with collecting taxes, increasingly resorted to heavy-handed methods to maintain state income, alienating peasants and merchants alike. For villagers and city dwellers, the world felt simultaneously familiar and unstable. Markets still operated, bread was baked, prayers were said, but the invisible pressures of taxation and corruption weighed heavily on daily life. To confront these challenges, the Ottomans launched a series of reform efforts. Early attempts focused on the military, training new troops, modernizing artillery, and importing European expertise. Administrators experimented with reorganizing provincial governance, attempting to curb corruption and improve tax collection. However, reform was slow, inconsistent, and often met with resistance. The Janissaries, for example, viewed modernization as a threat, and their opposition could paralyze even the most well-intentioned sultan. Cultural life, in contrast, continued to flourish. Cities remained vibrant, centers of learning and artistry. Architects like Mimar Kemal produced works that blended Ottoman tradition with emerging styles, while scholars debated theology, philosophy, and science. Coffee houses proliferated, serving as informal hubs of intellectual exchange where people discussed politics, literature, and commerce. This period reminds us that even during times of decline, human creativity often finds ways to thrive. Yet the empire faced not only internal challenges but also the rise of nationalism and external pressure. In regions like the Balkans, diverse ethnic and religious groups began to assert their distinct identities, sometimes in response to Ottoman centralization or economic hardship. Revolts, uprisings, and local resistance became more frequent, testing the empire's capacity to maintain control. Simultaneously, European powers eyed Ottoman territories with ambition, negotiating treaties that gradually chipped away at Ottoman sovereignty and territorial integrity. Consider daily life in this period. A merchant in Aleppo or Thessaloniki might still trade silk, coffee, and spices, but he would navigate new tariffs, fluctuating currencies, and the occasional inspection by a local official whose loyalty lay somewhere between empire and self-interest. Farmers in Anatolia still tilled the land, but droughts or heavy taxation could devastate entire communities. Janissaries patrolled the streets, sometimes protecting order, sometimes asserting power. Life was lived in the balance between survival and aspiration, between routine and the unpredictable forces of empire. Religion remained a stabilizing force, mediated through the millet system. Local religious leaders collected taxes, settled disputes, and maintained customs, creating a degree of continuity even as political authority wavered. Mosques, churches, and synagogues continued to serve as centers of community life, reinforcing social cohesion in a period of increasing uncertainty. And yet, the Ottomans were aware of the changing world around them. European powers were experimenting with printing, engineering, and science at a pace that threatened Ottoman technological and intellectual dominance. Reform-minded administrators sought to import knowledge, sending students abroad and inviting foreign experts. But progress was uneven. Resistance from conservative factions, entrenched interests, and the inertia of centuries-long traditions slowed change to a crawl. It is striking to imagine the empire at this moment, a state of immense size, layered governance, and rich cultural life, yet increasingly pressured by forces it could not fully control. The machinery of administration still functioned, but the strain was evident in delayed orders, revolts, and economic instability. Ordinary people continued to live, work, and worship, often unaware of the slow transformation occurring at the empire's heart. Yet they bore its consequences in daily burdens and fleeting opportunities. And so, we are left with an image of the Ottoman Empire as both resilient and vulnerable, a sprawling structure sustained by routine, loyalty, and bureaucracy, but fraying at its edges under the pressures of modernization, nationalism, and external threat. Even in decline, it remained a vibrant, living entity, a testament to centuries of adaptation, negotiation, and human endurance. Here is a question to consider as you reflect quietly. Can an empire survive when its systems are strong but its leaders are hesitant, its soldiers powerful but increasingly self-interested, and its economy shifting beyond its control? How long can an old oak hold against the slow currents of change before it finally succumbs? By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the unchallenged power it had been in Europe and the Middle East. Centuries of expansion, conquest, and adaptation had built a state of remarkable complexity, but the world was changing around it. Industrialization, nationalism, and new European military techniques now posed challenges that traditional Ottoman systems struggled to address. The empire was vast, layered, and still culturally vibrant, but its old methods were increasingly inadequate to manage the forces converging on its borders. One of the empire's most significant responses was the Tanzimat, the reorganization period, that began in 1839. These reforms attempted to centralize administration, modernize the military, and codify laws to create a more equitable system of governance. In theory, every subject would have protection under a single, unified legal framework, and provincial officials would be held accountable to the central government. In practice, implementation was uneven. The empire's vast geography made communication slow. Local officials resisted changes, and conservative religious authorities sometimes opposed reforms that threatened established authority. Military modernization was another focus. European armies had developed new drills, artillery, and engineering techniques that left Ottoman forces increasingly vulnerable. The Tanzimat included reorganizing the army along European lines, importing training methods, and even hiring foreign advisors. Yet, as with administrative reforms, these measures often met resistance. The Janissaries, long a central military force, had been abolished in 1831 after centuries of political meddling, but creating an equally loyal and effective replacement proved challenging. Soldiers trained in new methods sometimes lacked the discipline of old, and old loyalties lingered in the provinces. Economically, the empire faced growing pressure from Europe. Industrialized nations could produce goods more cheaply than Ottoman artisans, and European merchants increasingly bypassed traditional Ottoman trade routes. Attempts to regulate trade and encourage local manufacturing met limited success, as infrastructure, education, and capital were insufficient to compete with the rising industrial powers. Ordinary people felt the impact through taxation, inflation, and the uncertainty of local markets. Farmers and merchants were still the lifeblood of the empire, yet they were increasingly vulnerable to both natural and economic disasters. Nationalism became another destabilizing force. The Balkans, long a mosaic of ethnic and religious groups, began to demand autonomy or independence. Greece achieved independence in 1833, after decades of rebellion and intervention by European powers. Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria followed later in the century, often after prolonged conflict. Each loss of territory was not just a political event, but a social shock, as communities accustomed to Ottoman administration adapted to new national identities. The empire, once expansive and cohesive, was gradually shrinking under both internal and external pressure. Despite these challenges, cultural and intellectual life continued to thrive. Istanbul, Damascus, Cairo, and other cities remained centers of scholarship, trade, and religious life. Schools and universities were established to teach new sciences and military techniques. Newspapers proliferated, and coffeehouses served as informal hubs for debate and social networking. Artists, architects, and writers continued to create, blending Ottoman traditions with European influences. Even as the empire faced decline, it retained a richness of life and human activity that few contemporary states could match. Daily life for ordinary people remained a delicate balance. A farmer might still tend fields in Anatolia, a merchant in Aleppo or Thessaloniki might navigate new tariffs and trade agreements, and a soldier might train under a foreign drill master while still observing centuries-old customs. Religion continued to provide structure and stability through the millet system, while local authorities mediated disputes and maintained social cohesion. Ordinary routines, meals, prayers, festivals, market exchanges persisted, often unaffected by the distant and complex machinations of empire. Yet, the empire's vulnerabilities were becoming more visible. Communication across provinces remained slow, corruption persisted in local administration, and the financial system struggled to support military and civil reforms simultaneously. European powers exerted increasing influence, both diplomatically and militarily, sometimes intervening directly in conflicts or indirectly through economic pressure. The empire's survival increasingly depended on careful negotiation and delicate balance rather than straightforward power. And yet, one of the most remarkable aspects of this period is how adaptive the empire remained. Even as territories were lost, reforms were only partially successful, and European powers encroached on its influence. The Ottoman state endured. Cities remained vibrant, religious and ethnic communities continued their lives, and the machinery of government, cumbersome, flawed, but functional, continued to operate. Ordinary people, soldiers, and administrators alike contributed to this resilience, maintaining a sense of order amidst uncertainty. So as you picture the Ottoman world in the 19th century, imagine a complex, layered empire facing pressures both within and beyond its borders. The empire was no longer expanding. It was adapting, struggling, and holding together in the face of forces it could not fully control. The grand palaces, mosques, and marketplaces still dazzled, but beneath them, the fabric of authority was under tension. Ordinary people lived their lives in this uncertain context, unaware of the full scale of change yet feeling its effects daily. Here is the thought I leave you with. Can an empire survive for centuries on adaptation alone, even as the world moves faster than its systems? How long can resilience delay the inevitable transformations that history demands? By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a shadow of its former self. Territories that had once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Red Sea had been whittled down through wars, treaties, and nationalist uprisings. The empire was often called the sick man of Europe, a label that might have seemed harsh, but reflected a state struggling to maintain cohesion in the face of internal weakness and external pressures. Yet, even in this period of decline, the empire remained an intricate and functioning society, a world of cities, villages, markets, and courts, sustained by centuries of accumulated systems, habits, and human resilience. The empire faced immense internal challenges. Nationalist movements in the Balkans and the Arab provinces increasingly demanded autonomy or independence. Greece, Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria had achieved sovereignty earlier in the century. Now other groups sought to follow suit. These nationalist movements were often intertwined with European diplomacy. Great powers like Britain, France, and Russia exerted influence to protect their own strategic interests. For the Ottomans, every concession made to one group risked alienating another, creating a delicate and dangerous balance. In response, the empire attempted sweeping reforms. The Tanzimat had begun earlier, but by the late 19th century, the Young Turks emerged as the most vocal proponents of modernization. They advocated constitutional government, centralized authority, and military and educational reform. In 1892, the first Ottoman constitution was introduced, and although it faced resistance, it marked a significant attempt to reimagine governance for a changing world. Ordinary citizens saw both promise and uncertainty, a new legal system, the possibility of more consistent taxation, and the hope that corruption could be curbed. Yet these reforms were unevenly applied, and the tension between old habits and new laws often led to confusion or resistance in local communities. The military, once the empire's backbone, faced unprecedented challenges. European armies had become industrialized, using advanced artillery, rifles, and logistics that the Ottomans struggled to match. Attempts to modernize the army were met with mixed results. Some units were trained in European methods, but traditional units and local irregulars often resisted change. Moreover, financial limitations hindered procurement of modern weapons, and the empire increasingly relied on alliances with Germany and other powers to supplement its military strength. Soldiers continued to train, march, and fight, but their world was no longer one of certain victory. Battles became costly and uncertain. Economically, the empire was in flux. European industrial goods flooded Ottoman markets, undermining local artisans and traditional trade networks. Railroads and telegraph lines introduced modern infrastructure, but often under European financial control, creating new dependencies. Rural peasants bore the brunt of taxation, while urban populations faced rising prices and social instability. Yet life went on. Merchants traded, farmers cultivated, artisans worked, and markets buzzed with activity. Survival and adaptation remained central to daily existence. World War I brought the empire to its final, decisive crisis. The Ottomans entered the conflict alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoping to regain lost territories and assert influence. Battles stretched across the Middle East, the Caucasus, and the Dardanelles, leaving devastation in their wake. Soldiers, many conscripted from distant provinces, faced harsh conditions, disease, and modern weaponry that made traditional tactics obsolete. Civilians endured food shortages, displacement, and the constant uncertainty of war. The empire, already weakened, could not withstand the pressures of global conflict. The war's end sealed the empire's fate. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1917 partitioned Ottoman lands among the Allied powers, carving out mandates and recognizing new national states. The empire, once a vast and layered authority, was reduced to fragments, with Anatolia as the only remaining core. Ordinary people faced dislocation, loss, and the challenge of rebuilding in a world that no longer recognized the old order. Yet from the ruins emerged a new vision. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk led the Turkish War of Independence, rejecting the partitioning of Anatolia and establishing the Republic of Turkey in 1923. The Ottoman Empire, after 6 centuries, had ended, but its legacy in law, architecture, culture, and daily life lived on in modern Turkey and across the regions it once ruled. Imagine standing in Istanbul during those final decades, the skyline dominated by mosques, domes, and minarets, markets still alive with trade, streets echoing with conversation in multiple languages. Soldiers patrolled streets, officials navigated reform decrees, scholars debated, and families carried on with ordinary life. Even as political authority faltered, human resilience persisted. Life continued mundane, vital, and necessary amid the collapse of centuries-old systems. Here is a final thought for this section. Can an empire's true strength be measured not by its borders or armies, but by the persistence of daily life, by the ability of ordinary people to adapt, survive, and maintain culture even as the political order crumbles? Even as the Ottoman Empire's political and military power faltered in the 19th and early 20th centuries, its culture remained vibrant, deeply layered, and influential. To walk through Istanbul, Damascus, Cairo, or Baghdad during this period was to witness a living tapestry of art, architecture, scholarship, and daily human ingenuity. While historians often focus on wars, treaties, and reforms, the true pulse of the empire was carried by ordinary people, artisans, students, and scholars who shaped life in ways that outlasted battles and sultans. Architecture continued to define the empire's skyline. Even in the later centuries, architects built mosques, bridges, fountains, and public baths that combined functionality with beauty. Domes rose alongside minarets, harmonizing form and spiritual purpose. Sinan's legacy remained influential, but new generations adapted his principles to contemporary needs, integrating European elements while preserving Ottoman identity. Each stone laid, each arch carved, was both an aesthetic choice and a social statement, reflecting the empire's commitment to creating spaces for worship, commerce, and community. Artisans and craftsmen, too, maintained traditions while experimenting with new ideas. Calligraphy, long a pinnacle of Ottoman artistry, remained a symbol of devotion and intellect. Illuminated manuscripts, decorated with intricate arabesques and vibrant inks, were created not only for elites but also for local schools and religious institutions. Carpet weaving, pottery, metalwork, and textiles sustained both domestic use and trade. In workshops and homes, techniques passed through generations, blending innovation with time-tested skill. For ordinary people, participation in these crafts was both livelihood and contribution to cultural continuity. Literature and poetry flourished in parallel. The empire's scholars produced commentaries on law, religion, and philosophy, while poets and storytellers composed works that explored love, morality, history, and human experience. Even as political authority weakened, the intellectual life of the empire continued, often in spaces like coffeehouses, madrasas, and private salons. A poet could inspire a community, a scholar could guide debate, and an artisan could encode stories into the patterns of a carpet or the motifs of a fountain. Ordinary life, mundane as it might seem, was therefore imbued with artistry and reflection. Education became increasingly important during this period of change. Traditional religious schools coexisted with newly established institutions that taught modern sciences, languages, and engineering. Students traveled to study in distant cities or even abroad, returning with knowledge that could aid the empire's modernization efforts. Literacy spread gradually, fueled by printing presses introduced later than in Europe, but eventually transforming access to books, news, and ideas. Families valued education as a path to social mobility and intellectual engagement, ensuring that even amid decline, human potential was cultivated. Religious life remained central. The millet system continued to structure communal affairs, providing consistency and local autonomy. Mosques, churches, and synagogues not only offered spiritual guidance, but also acted as community centers. Celebrations, festivals, and rituals punctuated the year, maintaining social cohesion. Ordinary citizens, whether farmers, merchants, or artisans, found stability and identity within these structures, even as political authorities struggled to maintain coherence. Music and performance also thrived. Classical Ottoman music, with its intricate rhythms and melodic modes, was performed in courts, public spaces, and private homes. Folk music, dance, and storytelling preserved local traditions, connecting generations to their heritage. Even in times of social and political upheaval, these forms of cultural expression offered continuity, joy, and communal identity. Daily life, as always, was the foundation of this cultural resilience. Markets buzzed with trade, workshops hummed with production, children learned skills from parents, elders transmitted wisdom. Life went on amid uncertainty, showing that human adaptation and creativity are often the most enduring forces in history. While sultans changed, borders shifted, and wars raged, these small acts, weaving a carpet, composing a poem, teaching a child, ensured the survival of the empire's essence. The empire's decline did not erase its achievements. Instead, it highlighted the distinction between political power and cultural vitality. Even as armies faltered, reforms faltered, and territories were lost, the Ottoman cultural world remained rich, complex, and influential. Its legacy extended far beyond its political lifespan, leaving marks on architecture, art, literature, music, and social organization that persisted long after the empire dissolved. So as you imagine the late Ottoman world, picture not only the halls of power but the workshops, schools, and marketplaces that sustained life and culture. Picture calligraphers bending over parchment, students debating in madrasas, merchants negotiating prices in crowded bazaars, and families observing rituals that had endured for centuries. This is the true heartbeat of the empire. Human resilience and creativity woven into everyday existence. And here is the question I leave you with tonight. Can the cultural achievements of a civilization outlast the political and military forces that built it? In the quiet rhythms of daily life, who truly carries the legacy of an empire forward? By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire faced pressures that were no longer abstract or gradual but immediate and existential. Years of territorial losses, economic strain, and political instability had weakened central authority, leaving provinces vulnerable to unrest and foreign intervention. The world was changing faster than the empire could adapt, and the stage was set for the ultimate test of its resilience. World War I. The war was catastrophic for the Ottoman state and its people. Soldiers were conscripted from across Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Arab provinces, often sent to battlefields hundreds or thousands of miles from their homes. Conditions were harsh. Disease, inadequate supplies, and modern weaponry inflicted devastating casualties. Imagine a young conscript, trained briefly in European military drills, marching across rugged terrain, witnessing friends and comrades fall, yet still expected to uphold the empire's honor. The human cost was immense, yet life continued elsewhere. Families tended fields, cities continued to function, and communities tried to maintain routines amid chaos. Civilians bore the brunt of the war's disruptions. Food shortages, inflation, and blockades created widespread hardship. Villages experienced depopulation as men went to war, leaving women, children, and the elderly to sustain agriculture and local economies. Cities like Istanbul faced overcrowding, rationing, and epidemics. Ordinary citizens became both observers and victims of history, unfolding on a vast, impersonal scale. Survival depended on resourcefulness, community networks, and sheer perseverance. Amid this suffering, local governments and communities struggled to maintain order. Provincial administrators faced the impossible task of collecting taxes, ensuring supply lines, and mediating disputes, all while under the shadow of foreign military threats and internal unrest. In many areas, traditional systems of authority persisted. Religious leaders, village elders, and guilds provided continuity, but their influence was increasingly challenged by the chaos of war and the presence of occupying forces. The empire's social fabric was tested by multiple simultaneous crises. Refugees fled conflict zones, carrying with them the trauma of violence and displacement. Public health crises emerged, exacerbated by overcrowding and limited medical resources. Women took on new responsibilities, managing households, farms, and even small businesses, while men fought at the front. Children continued to attend schools where possible, learning to read and write, but often amid uncertainty and fear. Daily life became a constant negotiation between necessity and survival. World War I also accelerated the disintegration of Ottoman territories. Arab provinces, inspired by nationalist movements and supported by European powers, rebelled, seeking independence or autonomy. The empire's control over distant regions eroded rapidly, highlighting both the limits of central authority and the power of local initiative. Ordinary residents found themselves caught between shifting allegiances, uncertain which authority to obey and how best to protect families and property. Despite these challenges, cultural life persisted in pockets. Scholars continued their studies, artisans produced works for domestic and foreign markets, and families maintained religious and social traditions. Coffee houses, though diminished, remained spaces for discussion and reflection. Even amid war, human resilience endured, showing that the collapse of political structures does not immediately erase the richness of daily life. The end of the war brought the formal partitioning of Ottoman lands. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1917 sought to carve up Anatolia and the remaining territories among the Allied powers, creating new nations and mandates. Ordinary people faced displacement, uncertainty, and the loss of familiar social and economic structures. Istanbul, once the hub of a vast empire, now had to contend with diminished authority, foreign presence, and an uncertain future. Yet, from this chaos emerged determination. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk organized the Turkish War of Independence, mobilizing ordinary citizens, former soldiers, and provincial leaders to resist partition. Communities supplied food, shelter, and intelligence, demonstrating the remarkable agency of people often overlooked in grand historical narratives. The successful campaign culminated in the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, marking the official end of the Ottoman Empire after more than 6 centuries. Imagine standing in Anatolia during these final years. Families navigating shortages, soldiers marching to uncertain fates, children learning amid disruption, and communities attempting to preserve continuity. Ordinary people bore the weight of history, adapting, surviving, and, in some cases, shaping the outcome of the empire's final chapter. Their stories, often invisible in traditional histories, reveal the persistence of human resilience amid monumental upheaval. So as you reflect on the Ottoman Empire's final years, Consider this. How much of history is determined by sultans, treaties, and armies, and how much is sustained by the quiet, persistent acts of ordinary people trying to live, adapt, and survive in a world suddenly transformed? With the formal end of the Ottoman Empire in 1923 and the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, a new era began. Istanbul, once the seat of a sprawling empire, became part of a national framework focused on modernization, secularization, and centralization. Ankara was chosen as the new capital, symbolizing a deliberate break from the past and a commitment to a future defined by reform. But while political structures were reshaped, the human and cultural legacies of the empire remained deeply embedded in everyday life across Anatolia and beyond. Ordinary people experienced this transition in tangible ways. Families who had once identified as subjects of a sultan now navigated the responsibilities and rights of citizenship. Educational reforms introduced modern curricula in schools, emphasizing science, mathematics, and secular law alongside traditional subjects. Rural communities, while distant from the centers of power, gradually encountered new regulations governing agriculture, taxation, and governance. Life in many ways was both continuity and rupture. The rhythms of daily labor persisted, yet the authority directing those rhythms had fundamentally changed. Cultural continuity remained a significant thread, connecting the Ottoman past to the Turkish present. Mosques, public baths, markets, and artisanal traditions continued to operate, even as the state emphasized modernization. Ottoman architecture, calligraphy, and literature left a lasting imprint, influencing everything from urban planning to domestic design. Markets still buzzed with traders selling carpets, spices, and textiles, while coffee houses remained spaces for social interaction, now discussing republican ideas instead of imperial decrees. Ordinary people carried forward these practices, preserving continuity amid transformation. The social landscape was also transformed by the population movements and displacements that accompanied the empire's collapse. Refugees, expelled communities, and resettled populations reshaped local economies, labor practices, and cultural life. Cities like Istanbul and Izmir became increasingly cosmopolitan, reflecting both the Ottoman legacy of diversity and the disruptions of political change. Families adapted to new surroundings, integrating skills, knowledge, and traditions into the fabric of emerging Turkish society. National identity emerged as a central focus. The new republic emphasized Turkish language, education, and governance, seeking to create a cohesive sense of citizenship. Schools taught history that emphasized the modern state, sometimes sidelining the multi-ethnic, multi-religious experiences of the Ottoman past. Yet, within homes, neighborhoods, and workplaces, memories and practices from the empire persisted. Traditional culinary practices, storytelling, artisanal crafts, and religious observances continued, bridging centuries of experience into daily life. Economic adaptation was equally significant. The new government invested in infrastructure, industry, and agriculture, aiming to modernize an economy that had long depended on traditional trade and artisan production. Ordinary people engaged with these changes in ways both subtle and profound. Farmers experimented with new crops, artisans learned new techniques, or migrated to urban centers, and merchants navigated the evolving regulatory environment. Daily routines adapted, blending old knowledge with new opportunities, sustaining livelihoods while participating in the transformation of society. The empire's intellectual legacy remained influential. Ottoman scholarship, jurisprudence, and literature continued to inform the new republic even as secular and modernist ideas gained prominence. Public libraries, universities, and private collections preserved centuries of knowledge. Coffee houses and social spaces became sites of intellectual exchange, where citizens discussed republican ideals, international developments, and the lessons of the past. Ordinary people engaged with these ideas, shaping their communities and contributing to the ongoing cultural evolution. Artistic traditions likewise persisted. Calligraphy, miniature painting, carpet weaving, and music continued to flourish, often adapting to new tastes and audiences. Artists blended Ottoman heritage with European influences, creating works that reflected both continuity and innovation. These cultural practices provided not only aesthetic enjoyment, but also a sense of identity, connecting citizens to a lineage of creativity that predated the Republic. Religion remained an enduring presence, though redefined under the new secular state. Communities maintained rituals, observances, and social structures that had evolved under the millet system. While the state promoted secular governance, religious practices continued to shape daily life. Celebrations, dietary customs, and life cycle ceremonies persisted, grounding ordinary people in a familiar rhythm amid political transformation. As you imagine life in this period, picture ordinary households negotiating between past and present. Parents drew on Ottoman traditions while teaching children Republican ideals. Markets carried goods shaped by centuries of trade and new industrial products. Scholars debated law and philosophy, while artisans crafted objects echoing historical styles. Life, in its mundane and essential details, continued a bridge between empire and republic, between the familiar past and the uncertain future. And so, the question arises, can the essence of a civilization endure even when its political structures vanish? In the daily acts of work, learning, worship, and artistry, who truly carries forward the legacy of a world that no longer exists as it once did? Even after its political dissolution, the Ottoman Empire continued to shape the lives, cultures, and systems of the regions it once ruled. Its influence stretched far beyond Anatolia and Istanbul, leaving imprints in the Balkans, the Levant, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Centuries of administration, trade, law, and social organization had created structures that persisted long after the sultans and viziers were gone. To understand the empire's enduring impact, it is essential to examine how ordinary people lived within and adapted to these legacies. One of the most enduring Ottoman contributions was administrative organization. The empire had relied on sophisticated bureaucracies to manage provinces, collect taxes, and maintain law and order. These systems, often seen as rigid, provided continuity and structure. When new nation-states emerged in the Balkans or the Middle East, they frequently inherited Ottoman frameworks for governance, legal codes, and taxation. Local officials, trained under the old system, became key players in establishing new governments. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, continued to navigate familiar processes, paying levies, registering property, and appealing to local authorities. This continuity demonstrates how deeply the Ottoman administrative approach had embedded itself in daily life. Trade networks established under Ottoman rule also left lasting effects. Caravan routes, ports, and marketplaces facilitated the movement of goods across continents. Merchants in Aleppo, Beirut, and Thessaloniki continue to operate in spaces shaped by Ottoman customs, practices, and regulations. Even as European colonial powers introduced new trade routes and markets, these networks allowed for the persistence of local commerce, craft production, and artisanal expertise. Farmers, traders, and artisans remained integral to sustaining economies, ensuring that ordinary life retained connections to the empire's past systems. Legal and religious institutions formed another aspect of Ottoman legacy. The millet system, which allowed religious communities to govern their internal affairs, influenced minority rights, social cohesion, and community organization long after the empire ended. Jews, Christians, and Muslims in former Ottoman territories maintained practices of self-governance, dispute resolution, and communal education. Religious leaders continued to serve as social anchors, guiding daily life and maintaining traditions. For ordinary people, this continuity provided stability amid the political upheaval of nation-building and changing borders. Cultural and artistic influence persisted as well. Ottoman architecture, with its domes, minarets, and public spaces, continued to define urban skylines in cities like Sarajevo, Thessaloniki, and Cairo. Culinary traditions, music, and textile production carried forward Ottoman aesthetics and techniques, blending them with local styles. Even small towns retained crafts, oral storytelling, and festive customs rooted in centuries of empire-wide practice. Families transmitted these traditions through generations, maintaining cultural memory in everyday life. Language, too, reflected Ottoman legacy. Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and other languages used in administration, literature, and scholarship continued to influence regional speech, education, and governance. Place names, legal terms, and common expressions persisted, embedding the empire's imprint in the linguistic fabric of modern societies. Ordinary people, whether scholars, merchants, or farmers, were carriers of this linguistic heritage, often unaware of its broader historical significance. In the Balkans, the Ottoman influence shaped architecture, urban planning, and legal norms for generations. Cities like Sarajevo, Skopje, and Belgrade bore witness to Ottoman-style mosques, bridges, and public baths, integrated alongside local styles. The same was true in the Levant and North Africa, where Ottoman governance structures and cultural practices persisted alongside new colonial administrations or emerging nation-states. Communities adapted, blending continuity with innovation to sustain livelihoods and social cohesion. Even social customs, from hospitality practices to marriage rituals and market etiquette, reflected centuries of Ottoman influence. Daily life, from baking bread to celebrating religious festivals, carried echoes of imperial norms. Ordinary people preserved these practices because they were functional, familiar, and deeply embedded in community life, demonstrating how human habits can sustain cultural memory far longer than political institutions. The empire's military and legal legacies also had long-term effects. Former Ottoman soldiers and officials often became leaders, advisors, or teachers in new nations, passing on knowledge of governance, logistics, and law. Judicial systems adapted Ottoman principles of justice, while administrative reforms drew on familiar templates for managing diverse populations. In every province, the invisible hand of Ottoman organization shaped how people lived, worked, and interacted with authority. As you picture the Ottoman legacy across these regions, imagine bustling marketplaces, mosque courtyards, artisanal workshops, and village councils functioning in ways established centuries earlier. Ordinary people, merchants, farmers, students, and artisans carried forward the practices, knowledge, and culture that defined the empire. Even without sultans, armies, or imperial bureaucracy, these small acts sustained continuity, linking the past to the present. And so, the question emerges: can the true measure of an empire's endurance be found not in its borders or armies, but in the daily practices, systems, and culture that outlast its political power? In every market, school, and village, who is quietly preserving the memory of centuries-long empire? As we look back over more than 6 centuries of Ottoman history, it is striking to see how human resilience, adaptation, and daily life defined the empire as much as battles, treaties, and sultans. From its earliest days as a small Anatolian principality to its vast expansion across 3 continents, the empire thrived not only because of military might or administrative sophistication, but because ordinary people, farmers, merchants, artisans, scholars, and soldiers sustained the systems that allowed it to endure. Their work, routines, and ingenuity created a living infrastructure that supported both imperial ambition and social stability. The empire's rise, expansion, and ultimate decline reveal lessons about power, adaptability, and human organization. Political authority was always layered, contested, and negotiated, yet bureaucracy, military institutions, and local governance allowed the state to function for centuries. Cultural life, architecture, Literature, music, art, and education flourished even when the empire faced existential crises. Ordinary people maintained livelihoods, preserved traditions, and adapted to new circumstances, ensuring that the empire's influence outlasted its political structures. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Ottoman story is how ordinary life persisted amid monumental events. Wars, sieges, and revolts were undeniably significant. But daily routines, the tending of fields, the production of goods, the teaching of children, the observance of rituals were the invisible threads that sustained society. Markets continued to function even in times of scarcity. Artisans continued to produce works of beauty, and communities maintained cohesion despite the shifting tides of politics and power. In these small, persistent acts, the empire's legacy was carried forward. The fall of the empire, while dramatic on a geopolitical scale, was part of a broader narrative of transformation rather than sudden disappearance. Provinces became nation-states. Sultans were replaced by presidents, and centuries-old institutions were reimagined or replaced. Yet, much of the social, cultural, and economic framework endured. Streets still carried Ottoman names, markets still followed centuries-old rhythms, and families preserved culinary, artistic, and linguistic traditions that bridged the imperial past and modern realities. Ordinary lives, often overlooked in historical narratives, became the true carriers of legacy. Ottoman history also teaches us about the fragility and resilience of civilizations. Military might and territorial expansion can only sustain an empire temporarily. Adaptation, bureaucracy, culture, and social cohesion determine longevity. Even when political systems crumble, human practices, cultural norms, and community resilience continue to influence future generations. The empire's endurance was as much about how people lived and adapted as it was about sultans or armies. Imagine walking through the streets of Istanbul today, or Thessaloniki, Sarajevo, or Cairo, and noticing the mosques, markets, bridges, and calligraphy that trace back to the Ottoman era. Imagine families preparing meals, artisans crafting textiles, scholars teaching students, and communities celebrating festivals, all practices echoing centuries of imperial life. These are the invisible legacies of an empire, maintained by countless ordinary people whose names are largely unknown, but whose contributions were vital. And so, as you reflect on the Ottoman Empire's entire history, consider this. Empires rise and fall, borders shift, and sultans are forgotten. But the cumulative acts of ordinary humans, the work, the rituals, the care for community, endure far longer than armies or treaties. History is not only recorded in grand narratives, but in the subtle, persistent rhythms of everyday life. In the quiet persistence of culture, commerce, and routine, the Ottoman Empire continues to live. Here is the thought I leave you with as this journey comes to a close. When we study history, are we witnessing the story of rulers and armies, or are we seeing, more profoundly, the story of ordinary people, their resilience, their creativity, and their enduring capacity to shape the world? Perhaps it is in this quiet, cumulative force that the true essence of an empire resides.